Passover begins tonight with the nation and the world's Jewish community celebrating the delivery of the Jewish people from slavery into freedom and liberty. Very significant religious observance throughout the world, and we are joined here on the Atlanta News First digital streaming desk by Herbie Ziskind, who is Special Assistant to the President and Deputy Communications Director. And Herbie, thanks for joining us from the White House. We are live here on the digital streaming desk for Atlanta News First across all of our digital streaming platforms. And really, we saw an opinion editorial, an op-ed, I should say, that President Joe Biden submitted to CNN.com, where he talks about not only the recognition and how important Passover is to the people of the world, but also framing it in context with several, very recent high-profile incidents of anti-Semitism across the nation. Talk to us a little bit about what the White House's position is on the issue of anti-Semitism and what it was that prompted the president to write this very moving and emotional and appealing editorial on CNN.com.
Well, thank you for having me. The president ran for president after what he saw in Charlottesville in 2017, when people were marching with torches spewing the same anti-Semitic bile that we saw in Nazi Germany in the 1930s. That's what prompted the president to run. That's why he has been focused on restoring the soul of our nation, as he often says. And he wrote this op-ed today on his efforts to combat anti-Semitism, because as we mark Passover, as we begin, as Jewish families across the United States and across the world recount the ancient story of going from slavery to liberation, it's important to reflect on where we're at in our own times. And we have seen across the United States over recent years a rise in anti-Semitic violence, hatred, targeting of Jewish Americans. And so this president has acted. He signed into law bipartisan legislation to make reporting on hate crimes easier and a higher priority. He has increased to record funding physical security that we have at synagogues, at Jewish community centers, at Jewish schools. And he has spoken out when we have seen anti-Semitic crime, anti-Semitic language on social media. The president has called it out. He's used his microphone to call it out. He invited, as the vice president did, a Holocaust survivor to the White House so that the president, the vice president, could bear witness. He has worked with people across the administration, bipartisan members of Congress, to address anti-Semitism. The second gentleman, Doug Emhoff, the first Jewish spouse of a president or vice president, traveled recently to Poland and Germany, visited a concentration camp to bear witness. And so just as we call out these acts, just as we call out the rise in anti-Semitism, this administration, this president will continue to take action as well.
Now, earlier this year in January, our legislative session usually lasts from early January to mid to late March. But the first couple of weeks of the session, we had an incident here in Metro Atlanta where several anti-Semitic flyers were distributed in the neighborhood of a freshman Democratic state lawmaker, a very prominent member of Atlanta's and the nation's Jewish community, and an attorney, Esther Panetich. And that really resulted in a bipartisan show of support for her and her community. And yet, with the introduction and authoring of a potential bill that would make anti-Semitism officially defined as a hate crime, we saw a lot of initial support, but the legislation lost a lot of muster and attention late in the session and ultimately was not passed. How closely is the Biden administration and the White House following incidents such as these, like what we've seen in Georgia, or is the White House focused more on a national approach rather than a state-by-state look?
We're following the rise in anti-Semitism all across the country, in communities across Georgia. You just named an example. There have been shootings, there have been physical assaults, there has been vandalism at schools, at temples. And so we are following this closely, and there was reporting from the FBI that there was a big increase in anti-Semitic attacks against Jewish Americans. And so this is why the president has spoken out. This is why the president continues to speak out about this hatred and this vitriol. And this is why he'll continue to take action and continue to make sure that the American people remember our history, remember what led to the greatest attack on Jews in history in World War II, and he will continue to lead on this while also taking action where we can. And I should add, the president established an interagency task force across the administration, across the federal government, to better coordinate our response to the rise in anti-Semitism across agencies, across the White House. We're working on a report that will be released that is the first national strategy to counter the rise in anti-Semitism. And so this is an ongoing work and an ongoing priority for the president, but we'll continue to monitor what's happening in the states and across the country.
In the president's op-ed on CNN.com, he quoted, according to the FBI, more than half of religious hate crimes in America in 2021 targeted Jews and were motivated by anti-Semitism. How do you counter the argument that defining the use of swastikas, that prohibiting or regulating anti-Semitic speech is an infringement on Americans' First Amendment right to free speech? How do you counter those claims and those arguments?
Look, everybody has a responsibility here. The government can and is taking action to counter the rise in anti-Semitism. There's a priority for people to stand up and speak out, especially when we see celebrities, famous people with large followings spew anti-Semitic tropes. And we also, have a responsibility among teachers, business leaders, tech companies to call out these sorts of terrible things that we're seeing online and on television. It's important that civil society speaks out, just as government moves to take action as well, just as this administration and this president is moving to take action as well.
You mentioned, and I've read in several accounts, books, and narratives that Joe Biden was really motivated. It was kind of almost the deciding factor in his decision to run came in 2018 when we saw the protests over removal of Confederate monuments throughout Virginia, and specifically Charlottesville, Virginia, and the counter-protests that arose that drew national attention. I remember covering it for the news outlet that I was working for at the time, and really just covering it live. Tell me, from the president's standpoint, since he's taken office, do you believe the White House has made any strides, or has the administration made any progress toward addressing these concerns? And if you have, why are we still seeing these kind of anti-Semitic incidents like what we witnessed here in Georgia back in January?
Look, this has been around for a lot longer than any of us have been alive, this sort of hatred. And as the president says, hatred doesn't go away, it only hides. And there are forces in society that can inflame the hatred and cause it to come back out from the shadows. There's no question that this continues to be a challenge. And there's no question that hate crimes against Jews, hate crimes against other groups as well, by the way, have been something that we've seen on the rise in recent years. This is what, again, motivated President Biden to get into the race in 2017 after seeing what happened in Charlottesville. And as long as he is president, he will continue to fight to call out anti-Semitism, to call out hatred against any groups, and to take action so that we live in an inclusive and safe society for all Americans.
We are wrapping up our conversation with Herbie Ziskin, Special Assistant to President Joe Biden and Deputy Communications Director at the White House. Just a final message for Passover, for not only the nation's Jewish community, but for everyone who marks this time of year, regardless of their denomination or affiliation. What message would you like to send out to our viewers and our listeners and readers?
Well, to all Americans, to those who are celebrating tonight, Passover, and those who are not, this president will continue to stand up to create a safer and healthier and more inclusive democracy, to fight for the soul of our nation. And that work is ongoing.
Thanks to Herbie Ziskins, Deputy Communications Director at the White House. Thanks to all of you for watching here on Atlanta News First.
Thank you.